When Rachel Turner walks into a hospital for what should be a routine checkup, her trust is shattered by a shocking betrayal. But instead of succumbing to fear, she channels her pain into a fight for justice that will resonate far beyond her personal ordeal. Follow Rachel's journey as she becomes the unexpected leader of a movement advocating for patient rights, taking on a system resistant to change, and transforming her voice into one that speaks for many. What challenges does Rachel face, and how far will her determination take her? Join us to find out how one moment can spark a revolution. If Rachel's story intrigues you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and empower. Share your thoughts below. What would you do in her shoes? Let's begin. Rachel Turner woke to the first light of dawn, brushing the bedroom in pale gold. The room was still, bathed in a tranquility that seemed precious and fragile. For a moment, she lay motionless, absorbing the quiet before the day's demands swept in like an unrelenting tide. The soft rustle of the sheets and the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan above were the only sounds, a comforting prelude to what she knew would be a busy day. Michael's side of the bed was empty, the sheets neatly turned back. He had left early, as he often did, to manage the morning shift at Meadow Hill Medical Center. Rachel reached over and touched the cool fabric, a habit she developed in his absence. It was a small, private gesture that made her feel closer to him, even when their schedules barely aligned. Sitting up, Rachel swung her legs over the side of the bed and stretched, feeling the slight stiffness that had settled into her muscles over the past few months. She attributed it to stress, the constant strain of balancing her demanding job as a social worker with community projects and late nights spent coordinating outreach programs. She glanced at the clock, 6:45 a.m. The day was just beginning, but the familiar tightness in her chest reminded her it would be another long one. Rachel pushed herself up and padded into the bathroom, where her reflection stared back at her, eyes slightly shadowed but resolute. She splashed cold water on her face and focused on the sensation, letting it wash away the lingering vestiges of fatigue. Today, she reminded herself, she had an important appointment, one that Michael had gently insisted she make after noticing her exhaustion and subtle complaints about chest discomfort. "Promise me you'll go," he'd said the night before, his eyes warm with concern as they sat at the kitchen table sharing a late dinner. "Just to make sure everything's okay." Rachel had nodded, managing a small smile to reassure him. "I will. It's probably just stress." But deep down, she knew that the aches were different, more insistent. They didn't just whisper fatigue. They hinted at something deeper, something that worried her despite her attempts to dismiss it. Downstairs, the scent of the orange candle she'd left burning the night before mingled with the aroma of coffee from the automatic timer. Rachel poured herself a cup and stood by the window, watching the city come to life in the early light. Cars trickled down the street, their headlights flickering off as the sun rose higher. It was a scene she loved, the promise of new beginnings layered over a city she had dedicated herself to serving. The morning unfolded in a series of small, predictable moments. Emails answered, phone calls taken, a brief but animated conversation with Alicia, a volunteer from the community center. By the time noon approached, the tightness in her chest returned with a sharper edge. Rachel pushed back from her desk, breathing deeply and pressing a hand to her sternum. The ache was unfamiliar, a pulsing reminder that she needed to take her health more seriously. A knock at the door startled her. Alicia, with her bright eyes and halo of curly hair, stood in the doorway, concern etched across her face. "Rachel, are you okay? You look a little pale." Rachel forced a smile that she hoped looked convincing. "I'm fine, just a little worn out. I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon, so no need to worry." Alicia's frown didn't fade, but she nodded. "Good. We need you around here, so don't push yourself too hard, okay?" The words settled into Rachel like a strange mix of comfort and guilt. She prided herself on being the reliable one, the person others could turn to when they needed a steady hand. But today, that role felt heavy, its weight pressing down on her as she reached for her coat and car keys. The drive to Meadow Hill Medical Center was both familiar and unsettling. Rachel had been there countless times before, visiting Michael on his breaks, or helping coordinate community health initiatives. But today, the sight of the glass-fronted building with its clean, modern lines and bustling parking lot made her heart thud unevenly. She parked and sat for a moment in the car, staring at the entrance as people streamed in and out. Families, elderly patients with canes, mothers holding the hands of squirming children. All of them coming to this place seeking care, seeking answers. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the midday sun glancing off the windshields around her. Inside, the air was cool and carried the sharp scent of antiseptic. The familiar background hum of voices and the beeping of monitors mingled into a symphony of routine chaos. Rachel checked in at the front desk, where a nurse with a warm smile confirmed her appointment and directed her to the waiting area. The chairs were a neutral beige, worn but sturdy, arranged in rows that formed a grid across the room. Rachel sat and picked up a magazine from the table beside her, flipping through it absently. The articles and bright photos barely registered as she fought the tension coiling in her chest. This wasn't just fatigue. She could feel it now, a persistent low thrum of discomfort. "Ms. Turner?" The voice startled her, and she looked up to see a young nurse with a clipboard, her expression friendly but professional. "Dr. Monroe will see you now." Rachel stood, smoothing her skirt as she followed the nurse through a maze of hallways. The further they went, the quieter it became, the sound of the main lobby fading until there was only the soft squeak of the nurse's shoes and the distant whoosh of an air vent. The examination room they entered was bright and cold, its white walls stark under the overhead lights. "Dr. Monroe will be with you shortly," the nurse said, her smile lingering before she slipped out and closed the door. Rachel sat on the edge of the examination table, the thin paper crinkling beneath her. She glanced around at the medical posters tacked to the walls, diagrams of hearts and lungs that suddenly felt too intimate, too close to what she was feeling. The minutes ticked by, each one making the room feel smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher. When the door finally opened, Dr. Stephen Monroe stepped in, clipboard in hand. He was tall, with graying hair neatly combed and eyes the color of steel. He glanced at her briefly, then down at his notes, his expression neutral. "Good afternoon, Ms. Turner. Let's see what's brought you in today," he said, his voice clipped and professional. There was no small talk, no attempt to ease her nerves. Rachel swallowed, reminding herself that competence didn't always come with warmth. He asked a series of questions: symptoms, duration, any changes in lifestyle. Each question felt detached, as though he were ticking off a checklist without really looking at her. Rachel answered quietly, trying to suppress the growing unease that prickled at the back of her mind. "Lie back, please," Dr. Monroe instructed, gesturing to the examination table. Rachel complied, her heart beating faster as she settled against the stiff paper. The doctor moved methodically, checking her vitals and listening to her heart with a stethoscope that felt too cold against her skin. A moment later, he stepped back, scribbling something on his clipboard before looking up, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I'm going to secure your arms and legs for a diagnostic test," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Rachel's pulse quickened, confusion flashing across her face. "Is that necessary?" she asked, her voice hesitant but steady. Dr. Monroe didn't look at her as he answered. "Standard procedure," he said, already reaching for the straps. The leather felt cool and foreign against her wrists, tightening until she couldn't move. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, a sharp prickle of panic making her limbs tense. The sound of the buckles clicking into place echoed in her ears, each one a reminder of how suddenly control could slip away. The room, once merely sterile, now felt oppressive, its bright lights casting shadows that seemed to stretch toward her. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to stay calm, to remember that she was in a place of healing, surrounded by professionals. But the tightening straps and Dr. Monroe's cold demeanor made that belief falter, and a bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Rachel kept her eyes closed, focusing on the rhythmic rise and fall of her breath, each inhale and exhale a fragile tether to calm. The straps encircling her wrists and ankles felt too tight, pressing into her skin and locking her into place. The sound of Dr. Monroe, shifting papers, and moving instruments reached her ears, sharp and clinical, devoid of the reassurances she longed for. The silence between them stretched thin, punctuated only by the occasional rustle as he prepared for whatever came next. Rachel's mind spun, trying to anchor itself with rational explanations. Maybe this was protocol, some precaution for a diagnostic test she wasn't familiar with. Maybe she was overreacting. But no matter how many times she tried to convince herself, the coldness in Dr. Monroe's demeanor unsettled her. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, startling her enough to snap her eyes open. Relief washed over her when she saw a nurse with warm eyes and auburn hair, Lindsay Carter, standing in the doorway. Her presence brought a subtle shift to the room, the tension breaking slightly under the weight of her concern. "Dr. Monroe, I need to speak with you about an urgent matter," Lindsay said, her voice steady but firm. She glanced at Rachel, her gaze lingering just long enough to convey a silent question. "Are you okay?" Dr. Monroe's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He sighed, setting down his clipboard with a clatter that made Rachel flinch. "I'm in the middle of an exam, Nurse Carter," he said curtly. "It won't take long," Lindsay insisted, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she wouldn't be dismissed so easily. Dr. Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line, but he stepped out into the hallway, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The muffled murmur of their conversation seeped through the walls, just loud enough to hint at tension, but too quiet to discern any words. Rachel's heart thumped against her ribcage as she strained to listen, the cool air of the room pressing in on her. The tightness in her chest returned, this time sharper and more insistent. She flexed her fingers, testing the straps, but they held firm. Her breathing quickened, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling her nose and making her stomach twist. A moment later, the door reopened, and Lindsay stepped inside alone. Relief and confusion mingled in Rachel's mind as the nurse approached, her face tight with barely concealed worry. "I'm going to undo these," Lindsay said, her hands already moving to release the buckles. "I don't know what he was thinking." Rachel's eyes widened, shock and gratitude warring for control. "Thank you," she whispered as the straps fell away, leaving red marks where they had pressed against her skin. Lindsay paused, her gaze meeting Rachel's. "You're not the first to feel uneasy around him," she said, her voice low, a thread of something unspoken weaving through her words. "I'm going to make sure this is reported." The weight of those words settled heavily on Rachel. She flexed her wrists, the soreness a reminder that this was real, not some strange, unsettling dream. The nurse's presence, her swift and decisive actions, had pulled Rachel back from the edge of panic. But beneath the relief lay a simmering anger, an understanding that what had happened wasn't just a lapse in bedside manner. It was a breach of trust. Before Rachel could respond, the door opened again, and Michael strode in, his face a mask of controlled fury. His eyes found Rachel immediately, softening for a heartbeat before shifting to Lindsay, who stood like a sentry at Rachel's side. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension. Lindsay didn't flinch. "There was an issue during Rachel's exam. I intervened and undid the restraints," she said, meeting his gaze with the confidence of someone who knew she had done the right thing. Michael's jaw tightened as he turned to Rachel, his eyes searching hers for confirmation. She nodded, unable to find words, but conveying everything he needed to know in that simple gesture. His shoulders squared, and he turned back to Lindsay. "Thank you, Nurse Carter," he said, the edge in his voice softening. "Can you give us a moment?" Lindsay nodded and left the room, the door closing quietly behind her. Michael crossed the space between them, his hand finding Rachel's and squeezing gently. "I'm so sorry," he said, the strain in his voice betraying the storm of emotions he was holding back. "I'll make sure this is addressed." Rachel's fingers tightened around his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly, the words laced with both exhaustion and resolve. "But yes, it needs to be." The ride home was quiet, the weight of what had happened settling between them like an unwelcome passenger. Michael's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes flicking to Rachel with concern whenever they stopped at a light. She stared out the window, watching the city blur by in streaks of gray and green. The familiar landscape felt different now, altered by the realization that even places meant to heal could harbor shadows. When they arrived home, Rachel sat on the couch, the soft cushions offering a welcome reprieve from the sterile, cold examination table. Michael knelt in front of her, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of emotion that made her chest tighten in a different way. "We'll make sure this never happens again," he said, the promise in his voice unyielding. Rachel nodded, the gravity of their shared commitment sinking in. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And as the evening sun cast warm, golden light across the room, Rachel felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since she stepped into that examination room. Hope. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as Rachel sat on the couch, her mind replaying the events of the day. The tension in her chest had eased slightly, but the imprint of the straps on her wrists was still fresh, a physical reminder of how quickly things could spiral into the unthinkable. Michael sat beside her, his arm draped across her shoulders in silent solidarity. His presence was a comfort, a barrier against the dark thoughts that crept in when the silence grew too thick. "Do you want to talk about it?" Michael asked gently, his voice breaking through the quiet. Rachel sighed, rubbing her hands together as if she could erase the memory of being strapped down. "It just felt so wrong, Michael. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it was like I wasn't even there. Just a task to complete." The words tumbled out, each one dragging a piece of her fear with it. Michael's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking just below his cheekbone. "I know, and we're not letting this go. I've already spoken to the hospital's administration. They're opening an inquiry." Rachel's heart quickened at the thought. The idea of revisiting what had happened, of putting it into words for a room full of people, made her feel vulnerable all over again. But alongside that fear was something stronger, an anger that simmered just below the surface, demanding to be heard. "Good," she said, meeting his eyes with newfound determination. "People need to know. If he's done this before, if there's even a chance he'll do it again." Michael placed a hand on hers, the warmth seeping into her skin. "We'll make sure they listen," he said, his voice steady, anchoring her. The next morning, Rachel woke to a phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. She blinked at the screen, her heart sinking when she saw the number. It was the hospital. Bracing herself, she answered, the voice on the other end brisk and formal. "Mrs. Turner, this is Dr. Ellis, head of the hospital board. We'd like to request that you come in for a formal statement regarding the incident with Dr. Monroe. Would you be available this afternoon?" Rachel's throat tightened, but she forced her voice to remain even. "Yes, I can be there." When she ended the call, Michael was already awake, watching her with concern from his side of the bed. "Is everything okay?" Rachel nodded slowly. "They want my statement." Michael sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'll be there with you. You don't have to do this alone." "I know," Rachel said, a small, grateful smile breaking through the tension. "And that makes it easier." The boardroom was stark and imposing, its long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen. Rachel sat at one end, Michael beside her, and Lindsay Carter across the room. Lindsay's presence was a balm to her nerves, a silent reminder that she wasn't the only one who had witnessed Dr. Monroe's unsettling behavior. The head of the hospital board, Dr. Ellis, sat at the center, flanked by two senior members. His eyes were kind but serious as he spoke. "Mrs. Turner, thank you for coming in today. We understand that this isn't easy, but it's important that we gather as much information as possible." Rachel nodded, her fingers curling tightly in her lap. "I understand," she said, willing her voice to remain steady. "Whenever you're ready, please tell us what happened," Dr. Ellis prompted. Rachel took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment as she gathered her thoughts. "It started as a routine appointment," she began, recounting the details with careful precision. She described the cold, detached way Dr. Monroe had moved, the clinical tone of his voice, and the straps that had bitten into her skin. As she spoke, she saw the expressions around the table shift from attentive to troubled. Lindsay added her observations when Rachel paused, describing the moment she'd walked in and seen Rachel restrained, the unease that had prompted her to step in. Dr. Ellis leaned back in his chair, the creases on his forehead deepening. "Thank you both. This is deeply concerning, and it aligns with some other reports we've received. We will be conducting a thorough investigation into Dr. Monroe's conduct." Rachel's pulse quickened at the mention of other reports. She exchanged a look with Michael, who raised his eyebrows slightly, a silent acknowledgement that this was bigger than either of them had initially thought. "How long will the investigation take?" Michael asked, his tone measured but insistent. "It could take several weeks," Dr. Ellis admitted. "In the meantime, Dr. Monroe has been placed on administrative leave, and we will ensure that patient safety remains our top priority." Rachel nodded, the weight in her chest lightening just enough to feel the first glimmer of relief. The meeting adjourned, and as they left the room, Lindsay caught up with them. "You did great in there," she said to Rachel, her expression softening into a smile. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." Rachel nodded, gratitude warming her. "Thank you, Lindsay, for everything." The following days were a mix of tension and cautious hope. Rachel's phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues who had heard whispers of the investigation. Some offered support, while others shared their own stories, moments when they had felt dismissed or uneasy under Dr. Monroe's care, but hadn't spoken up. The realization that she wasn't alone in her experience was both heartbreaking and galvanizing. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table, poring over printed emails and handwritten notes from people who wanted to share their encounters. Each story was a thread, weaving a larger picture of a broken system that had allowed Dr. Monroe's behavior to go unchecked. Michael walked in, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. "You're carrying a lot," he said softly. Rachel looked up at him, the exhaustion in her eyes tempered by determination. "I need to. This is bigger than me now." He sat down beside her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I know, and I'm proud of you." One morning, Rachel received a call from Angela Perez, a lawyer specializing in patient rights who had read about the investigation. Angela's voice was calm, but filled with urgency. "Rachel, I'd like to meet with you. Your story is shedding light on an issue that goes beyond one doctor. If you're willing, I think we could make real change together." Rachel felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "Yes, I'd like that." The meeting with Angela marked the beginning of a new phase, one that would take Rachel beyond the confines of her personal story and into the broader fight for patient advocacy. It wasn't just about holding Dr. Monroe accountable. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to feel the fear and helplessness she had experienced. As she prepared for what was to come, Rachel felt a mixture of fear and resolve. The journey ahead would be long, but she was ready. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than the shadows of doubt. In the days following her meeting with the hospital board, Rachel found herself at the center of a swelling tide of attention and inquiry. News of the investigation into Dr. Monroe's conduct had spread, first as whispers among hospital staff, and then as quiet conversations in the waiting rooms and hallways of Meadow Hill Medical Center. Patients and nurses exchanged knowing looks, the kind that hinted at shared experiences and unspoken fears. Michael supported Rachel with unwavering dedication. At night, they would sit together in the living room, reviewing any updates and discussing the potential outcomes. The strain showed in the lines etched deeper into Michael's face, but his eyes remained steady when he looked at her. One evening, as they sat on the couch surrounded by stacks of printed testimonies and notes, Rachel's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway, her voice cautious. "Hello, Mrs. Turner, this is Angela Perez," said a voice on the other end. Angela's tone was warm, but serious. "I'm a patient rights attorney, and I've been following your story. I wanted to reach out because I believe we can use this moment to push for wider changes in patient advocacy and healthcare safety. If you're interested, I'd like to meet and discuss how we can work together." Rachel's breath caught. The idea of turning her ordeal into a platform for systemic change made the tightness in her chest lift just a little. "Yes, I'd like that," she said, her voice steady but tinged with relief. "Great. Let's meet tomorrow at noon if that works for you," Angela said, and after confirming the details, they ended the call. Michael watched her intently. "Good news?" he asked, the hopeful lift in his tone evident. Rachel nodded, setting her phone down and meeting his eyes. "A lawyer reached out. She wants to help us make this bigger. More than just an investigation into Dr. Monroe. She thinks we can advocate for lasting change." Michael's expression softened with admiration. "Rachel, that's incredible. This could be what we need to ensure it doesn't just end with one doctor's suspension." The next day, Rachel met Angela Perez at a small, quiet cafe downtown. Angela was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an air of confidence that immediately put Rachel at ease. They shook hands, and Angela gestured to the seat across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," Angela began, folding her hands on the table. "I've worked on several cases involving medical malpractice and patient neglect, but this situation with Dr. Monroe has the potential to shed light on a broader issue." Rachel nodded, leaning forward. "I've been getting emails and messages from people who had similar experiences. Some didn't even realize they could report it, that what happened to them wasn't normal." Angela's expression tightened. "And that's why this is so important. If you're willing, I want to help you form a coalition, something that goes beyond just holding Dr. Monroe accountable. We could work on pushing for stronger reporting systems and protections within hospitals to make sure patients have a voice." The idea sent a thrill through Rachel's tired bones. The thought of transforming her fear and pain into a force for good lit a fire she hadn't felt in weeks. "I'm in," she said, the conviction in her voice matching Angela's. "Good," Angela said, a small smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "This won't be easy, but I have a feeling you're up for the challenge." Rachel's life quickly took on a new, frenetic pace. Days were spent coordinating with Angela and Michael, who used his contacts within the hospital to gather more testimonies from those willing to come forward. Lindsay, the nurse who had intervened during Rachel's appointment, played a crucial role, connecting them with staff members who had seen signs of Dr. Monroe's troubling behavior over the years. One afternoon, as Rachel and Michael sifted through stacks of statements at the dining room table, Lindsay arrived with a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her expression was resolute as she handed it over. "These are copies of internal reports from years ago," she said, her voice low. "Complaints made by staff about Dr. Monroe's conduct. They were dismissed or buried under insufficient evidence." Rachel's hands shook slightly as she flipped through the pages, each one a testament to the neglect that had allowed him to remain unchecked. The reports told stories of patients left in distress and staff members who felt powerless to act. Michael leaned over, scanning the papers. "This could be pivotal," he said. "It's not just about what happened to you, Rachel. This proves that the system failed to act when it should have." The growing momentum of the investigation soon attracted media attention. Local news outlets requested interviews, and Rachel found herself on the evening news, recounting her experience not just as a victim, but as an advocate for change. The first time she saw herself on the screen, she felt a pang of vulnerability, her story laid bare for anyone to see. But when she received an outpouring of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers, it fortified her resolve. The day after the segment aired, Rachel sat down with Angela in a sunlit office filled with papers, whiteboards, and a map of local hospitals with pins marking potential allies. "We need to hold an event," Angela said, circling a date on the calendar. "Something that invites the community to come together and share their stories, to show that this movement is bigger than just one person." Rachel nodded, the idea sparking in her mind. "A town hall. We can make it open to anyone who wants to speak or listen. If people see how many stories there are, how much pain has gone unheard, it'll push for change." In the days leading up to the town hall, Rachel worked tirelessly, balancing her job, her new advocacy role, and her own healing. Michael was there at every step, coordinating logistics and reaching out to community leaders who had expressed interest. Even Angela seemed impressed by their commitment. The night of the town hall arrived with a crisp chill in the air. Rachel stood on the stage of the community center, the seats filling up with familiar and unfamiliar faces alike. The low murmur of conversation quieted as Angela took the microphone to introduce the evening. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Angela began. "We're here to talk about something that has gone unspoken for too long: patient advocacy, safety, and trust. And leading this conversation is someone whose courage has inspired us all. Rachel Turner, please come forward." The applause that followed was warm and supportive, but as Rachel stepped up, it felt like the weight of 1,000 stories settled on her shoulders. She took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd. "I came here tonight not just to tell my story, but to give voice to everyone who has felt unheard or unseen in a place meant for healing," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't just about what happened to me or about one doctor's misconduct. This is about the systems that need to change so that no one else feels afraid or powerless." Nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, others stood to share their experiences, some with tears, others with voices that shook but grew stronger as they spoke. Lindsay stood up to recount her moments of doubt and the decision to step in that day. Her words met with applause and gratitude. When the night ended, Rachel looked around the room, seeing faces full of hope, pain, and resolve. Michael stepped forward, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. Rachel nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "We did it, and this is only the beginning." As the crowd dispersed, leaving behind the echoes of their stories, Rachel felt a sense of purpose settle within her. She wasn't just surviving the aftermath anymore. She was fighting for something greater, something that would ensure that voices like hers were heard, believed, and protected. The days following the town hall were a whirlwind of movement and momentum. Stories from that night spread quickly through the community, shared by word of mouth and local news reports that captured snippets of impassioned testimonies. Rachel received countless emails, some from people who had attended, others from those who had watched the coverage and felt emboldened to share their own experiences. In the center of it all, Rachel felt a sense of hope tempered with urgency. She knew the work ahead wouldn't be easy, but the outpouring of support reinforced her belief that change was not only possible, it was necessary. One afternoon, Rachel and Angela sat in Angela's cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of papers, legal documents, and a whiteboard marked with dates and deadlines. The room hummed with a kind of focused chaos that had become their new normal. "We need to capitalize on this momentum," Angela said, tapping a marker against the board. "The public is paying attention. We should draft a proposal for new patient rights protocols that hospitals can adopt. We'll need to start with Meadow Hill, but if we can get them on board, it'll be a model for other hospitals." Rachel nodded, the weight of the task settling over her, but failing to crush her determination. "What do we need to make that happen?" Angela's eyes sparkled with resolve. "We need testimony, written support from medical professionals, and the backing of key community leaders. Lindsay's already on board, and I've reached out to a few others. We just need you to be the face of this. Your story, your courage, it's what's bringing people to the table." Rachel swallowed, the reality of her new role pressing down on her. "I'm ready," she said, more to herself than to Angela. "Let's do this." As word spread about their initiative, Rachel found herself speaking at more community events. Each time, she refined her message, balancing the emotional weight of her story with a clear call to action. Michael attended each event, standing at the back of the room with an expression that mixed pride and concern. He knew the toll this was taking on her, but he also saw how it fueled her, a paradox of healing and exhaustion. One evening, Rachel took the stage at a local university, her heart thumping as she scanned the packed auditorium. Students, professors, and members of the public filled the rows, their faces eager and attentive. "When I walked into Meadow Hill Medical Center that day, I was a patient in need of care," Rachel began, her voice steady. "But what I experienced made me realize how fragile trust can be when it comes to our health. And it made me see that when that trust is broken, the consequences echo far beyond the walls of one room." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But tonight, I'm not just here to share what happened to me. I'm here to tell you that we have the power to change this. That each of you, whether you're a future healthcare worker, a patient, or a member of this community, has a role to play in making sure that places of healing live up to their purpose. A ripple of nods and murmured agreement spread through the audience. After the speech, students approached her, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for speaking up. Others shared stories of family members who had suffered quietly, unsure of how to confront the system that had failed them. "I want to help," a young woman said, her voice trembling with resolve. "I'm studying to become a nurse, and hearing this, it changes how I see the kind of caregiver I want to be." Rachel's chest swelled with emotion. "That's exactly why we're doing this," she said, squeezing the young woman's hand. The proposal for patient rights protocols was coming together, a collaborative effort between Rachel, Angela, and a growing coalition of medical staff, patient advocates, and community leaders. They called it the Patient Assurance Act, a set of guidelines designed to ensure transparency in medical procedures, better communication between patients and providers, and a clear process for reporting and addressing misconduct. Lindsay played a critical role in gathering testimonials from her fellow nurses, many of whom had witnessed instances where patients felt marginalized or ignored but had been too afraid to speak up. One evening, she met Rachel at a cafe, a folder of signed statements in hand. "I can't believe how many people came forward," Lindsay said, sliding the folder across the table. "Some of them didn't even know where to start until they saw you speaking out." Rachel flipped through the pages, the stories striking a familiar chord of pain and resilience. "This will make a difference," she said, determination flaring in her eyes. "It has to." The day they presented their proposal to the Meadow Hill Medical Center Board was clear and bright, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation. Rachel stood at the podium, Angela beside her, and Michael watching from the back of the room. Dr. Ellis, the head of the board, sat at the center of the table, flanked by other members who wore expressions of both curiosity and guarded interest. The room was filled with reporters and community members, some standing in the back due to the overflow. Angela started with a concise summary of the proposal, outlining the changes they wanted to implement: mandatory patient advocacy training, anonymous reporting systems, and a commitment to better patient-staff communication. Then she turned to Rachel, who stepped forward, the papers in her hand trembling slightly. "This proposal isn't just a list of policies," Rachel said, her voice ringing through the room. "It's a promise to every patient who walks through those doors that their voice will matter and that their trust will be earned, not taken for granted." She took a breath, scanning the room. "I know this will take time. Change is never easy, and the path won't be smooth. But if we don't start now, then we risk more people feeling what I felt in that room, helpless, afraid, and alone. We can't let that happen." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Dr. Ellis exchanged glances with the other board members before nodding slowly. "Mrs. Turner, Ms. Perez, thank you for your work. The board will take this under serious consideration, and we'll begin discussing immediate steps toward integrating some of these protocols." The room broke in a quiet applause, and Rachel felt the tight coil of anxiety in her chest unwind just a fraction. As she stepped down from the podium, Michael caught her eye and gave her a subtle thumbs up. Angela squeezed her arm, a rare smile breaking across her face. Later that evening, Rachel and Michael sat in their living room, the silence between them comfortable and full of relief. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow across the room. "Do you think it's enough?" Rachel asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Michael wrapped his arm around her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "It's a start, and that's more than anyone could have hoped for a few months ago." Rachel smiled softly, the warmth of the fire matching the warmth in her chest. "We'll keep going," she said, more to herself than to him. "This isn't the end." Michael nodded, his gaze steady and full of pride. "No, it's not. It's just the beginning." The applause that had filled the room during the proposal's presentation still echoed in Rachel's mind days later. It wasn't just the sound of hands clapping. It was the acknowledgement that change was possible, that her voice had sparked something greater than herself. But as the days passed and the reality of implementing such sweeping reforms set in, Rachel knew they couldn't slow down. The proposal had been received with promise, but promises were fragile things. They needed action. Angela was relentless in following up with the hospital board, pushing for immediate movement on their proposal. Meetings with Meadow Hill's senior staff became a staple of Rachel's days, discussions that ranged from cautious to contentious. Not everyone was convinced, and some pushed back, citing concerns over budget, training time, and resistance from staff who were wary of new protocols. Rachel understood their hesitation, but refused to let it dissuade her. One morning, during a particularly tense meeting, Dr. Ellis leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he spoke. "Mrs. Turner, your points are compelling, but we need to be realistic. Implementing these changes will take significant resources and time. What assurances can you give that this will be worth the upheaval?" Rachel's heart pounded as she prepared her response, the room seeming to shrink around her. She glanced at Angela, who nodded subtly, and then met Dr. Ellis's eyes. "I understand your concerns," she said, her voice firm but calm. "But this isn't just about resources. It's about people. Real people who put their trust in this institution and deserve that trust to be honored. I can't promise that change won't come without challenges, but I can promise that doing nothing will cost more. It will cost us our community's trust, the safety of patients, and the integrity of the care we provide." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Dr. Ellis's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. "You make a compelling case, Mrs. Turner. We'll move forward with a pilot program to test the new protocols in several departments." Rachel felt a rush of relief, her breath leaving her in a silent sigh. It was a step, and even a small step was movement in the right direction. In the weeks that followed, Rachel's days blurred into a mix of meetings, phone calls, and drafting educational materials for the new pilot program. The workload was heavy, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Michael supported her at home, taking on more than his share of chores and ensuring she ate and rested when she could. One evening, after a particularly long day, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through emails when one caught her attention. The subject line read, "Thank you for being our voice." She clicked it open, her eyes skimming the words. "Dear Mrs. Turner, I watched your speech online, and it moved me to tears. My daughter had an experience at Meadow Hill years ago that we never spoke about publicly. Seeing you fight for change has given me the courage to come forward. Thank you for not giving up. You've given us hope." Rachel's vision blurred as she read the email again, the impact of the words settling into her bones. She looked up as Michael entered the room, his face softening when he saw her expression. "Another story?" he asked, sitting beside her. Rachel nodded, turning the screen toward him. He read silently, his eyes glistening as he looked back at her. "You're making a difference, Rachel." One voice at a time. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I couldn't do this without you," she said, her voice cracking just a little. Michael smiled, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "And you'll never have to." The pilot program launched with cautious optimism. Meadow Hill's administration rolled out the new protocols in selected departments, training staff on patient communication, transparency, and reporting procedures. Lindsay took an active role in the training, sharing her perspective as both a nurse and the person who had intervened for Rachel that day. Her words carried weight, and Rachel was grateful for the allies she'd found in her. The program faced initial resistance as expected. Some staff members were wary, unsure how these changes would affect their workload or relationships with patients. But gradually, as the training sessions continued and feedback was gathered, something shifted. Nurses reported more open dialogues with patients, and early reviews showed an increase in patient satisfaction scores. One afternoon, Lindsay met Rachel in the hospital's small break room, her expression brighter than it had been in weeks. "You need to hear this," Lindsay said, pulling out her phone. She played a voicemail from an older patient named Mrs. Callahan, who had been one of the first to benefit from the program. "Nurse Carter, I wanted to say thank you for listening to me the other day. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was really there for me. Whatever changes you're making, keep going. It's working." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat as the message ended. "This is why we're doing this," she said, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. Lindsay nodded, her eyes shining. "It's starting, Rachel. Real change." Despite the progress, the work was far from over. The proposal needed to expand beyond Meadow Hill and reach the broader network of hospitals. Angela pushed for meetings with local government officials to advocate for legislation that would make the patient rights protocols mandatory across the state. Rachel joined her, speaking at public hearings and drafting letters to influential figures who could champion their cause. One such figure was Councilmember Diane Reynolds, a respected leader known for her commitment to healthcare reform. Rachel and Angela met with her in a conference room at City Hall, the afternoon sun streaming through the large windows. Diane listened intently as they laid out their case, her expression thoughtful. "You've accomplished a lot in a short amount of time," she said, her tone measured but encouraging. "But taking this statewide will be a different kind of challenge. Are you prepared for that?" Rachel took a breath, the weight of the question sinking in. "We are, and we know it won't be easy, but it's worth it. This isn't just about one hospital or one patient. It's about making sure that every person who walks into a medical facility feels safe and respected." Diane nodded slowly. "I believe in what you're doing. Let's see how we can work together to make this happen." The first draft of the proposed legislation was written within weeks, a comprehensive set of standards that mirrored the protocols already in place at Meadow Hill. It included clear guidelines for patient rights, mandatory training for medical staff, and an independent oversight committee to address grievances. Rachel found herself at the forefront of a movement that had grown beyond her, supported by the stories of those who had come forward to share their pain and hope. The community rallied behind her, a testament to the power of shared experiences and collective resolve. One evening, as Rachel sat at her desk reviewing the final draft, Michael appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, a small smile playing on his lips. "Hey, advocate," he said, the nickname tinged with affection. "Do you realize how far you've come?" Rachel glanced up, the exhaustion in her eyes softening with warmth. "I think I do," she said, "but there's still more to do." Michael walked over, placing his hands on her shoulders. "And we'll keep going. Together." Rachel smiled, the fire in her chest burning steady and bright. Together. As the night deepened, the promise of tomorrow felt tangible, a reminder that even the smallest voices could rise into a chorus that demanded to be heard. And Rachel knew, with unwavering certainty, that she wouldn't stop until every voice had a chance to sing. As Rachel's movement gained traction, the work became more demanding than ever. Meetings spilled into late nights, and early mornings were spent fielding calls from journalists and potential allies. Voices for Justice had become a beacon for people across the state, a network of patients, healthcare professionals, and advocates who were finally being heard. Rachel was at the center of it all, driven by a deep resolve. The proposed legislation, now officially titled the Patient Protection and Advocacy Act, began to circulate through state legislative channels. Support came from unexpected places: doctors who recognized the need for reform, nurses who shared stories of their own frustrations with systemic neglect, and community leaders who understood the importance of trust in healthcare. Angela Perez had become a fixture at Rachel's side, her expertise and determination invaluable. The two women spent countless hours drafting speeches, reviewing policy details, and meeting with officials. One morning, they sat across from Councilmember Diane Reynolds in her office, going over the final steps needed to move the bill forward. "The biggest hurdle will be the vote," Diane said, tapping her pen against her notebook. "We've gathered a lot of support, but there are still those who are resistant. They worry about costs, implementation, and the impact on medical staff." Rachel leaned forward, the fatigue in her bones overshadowed by the fire in her voice. "We can't afford not to do this, Diane. If we don't act now, the costs, emotional, psychological, and even financial, will only grow. This isn't just a reform. It's a safeguard for every patient who walks into a hospital and every healthcare worker who wants to do better." Diane's eyes met Rachel's, a spark of admiration in their depths. "I know, and that's why I'm with you. We need to be prepared for the opposition, but I believe we have the momentum to push this through." The weeks leading up to the state Senate vote were a blur of public engagements, interviews, and town hall meetings. Rachel spoke at schools, libraries, and community centers, each appearance reinforcing the message that patient advocacy was not just a medical issue, but a human one. Michael joined her whenever he could, always in the back of the room, his presence a steady source of strength. One evening, Rachel stood before a crowd in a packed high school auditorium. The stage lights glared down on her, but she felt energized, drawing power from the hundreds of eyes watching her, many filled with hope and expectation. "We're here tonight because every person deserves to feel safe in the places meant to heal them," Rachel began, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "For too long, stories like mine and so many others have been whispered behind closed doors, shared in moments of pain and resignation. But not anymore. We're bringing those stories into the light because they matter. You matter." The crowd erupted into applause, some standing to cheer. Rachel took a deep breath, letting the sound wash over her. It was more than validation. It was a promise that she was not alone in this fight. After the event, a young man approached her, his hands shaking as he clutched a piece of paper. "Mrs. Turner, I just wanted to say thank you. My mom passed away a few years ago, and I always felt like her voice was lost in the system. Seeing what you're doing, it means more than I can say." Rachel's eyes welled up, and she reached out to touch his arm. "I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that with me. Your mom's story matters too. This is for her, and for everyone who has felt unseen." The day of the vote arrived with a tense, charged energy. Rachel and Angela stood outside the state capitol building, surrounded by supporters holding signs that read, "Protect patients, ensure trust, and healthcare without fear." Michael was there, his arm around Rachel's shoulders as they waited for news. Inside, the proceedings were long and filled with heated debate. The bill's opponents voiced concerns about funding and logistics, while its supporters emphasized patient safety and the moral imperative to act. Angela's phone buzzed every few minutes with updates, each one a small jolt of hope or anxiety. Finally, after hours that felt like days, the doors opened, and Councilmember Reynolds stepped out. Her expression was stoic until she caught Rachel's eye and smiled, a slow, triumphant smile that made Rachel's breath catch. "It passed," Diane said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "The Patient Protection and Advocacy Act has passed." The cheers that followed were deafening. Rachel felt Michael's arms wrap around her, lifting her off the ground as they both laughed, the sound filled with relief and disbelief. Angela clapped Rachel on the back, a rare grin breaking through her professional composure. "You did it, Rachel," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the crowd. Faces filled with joy, hope, and newfound confidence. They had taken a step toward a future where stories like hers would not be silenced or ignored. The weeks after the bill's passage were filled with celebrations and new challenges. Implementing the new protocols required coordination and patience, but the commitment from healthcare institutions across the state was promising. Rachel became a trusted voice in panels and discussions, her journey serving as both a warning and an inspiration. One day, as Rachel sat at her desk reviewing a new draft of training materials for hospital staff, a knock at the door startled her. Michael stepped in, a familiar sparkle in his eyes. "Guess who just got invited to speak at a national conference on patient rights?" he said, holding up an official-looking envelope. Rachel took it, her fingers brushing the seal. "Really? This is happening so fast." Michael leaned down, his voice soft. "Because people are listening. You've made them listen." Rachel opened the envelope, scanning the letter. The invitation was real, the acknowledgement of her work reaching far beyond what she had imagined. She set the paper down, a smile spreading across her face as she looked up at Michael. "Then let's keep going," she said, determination flaring once more. "There's more to be done." Michael nodded, pride and love in his eyes. "Together, we'll keep going." As the sun set behind them, casting warm light across the room, Rachel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She was no longer just the woman who had been silenced and afraid. She was an advocate, a leader, and a symbol of resilience. And with each step forward, she carried the voices of countless others with her, ensuring that they, too, would be heard. In the days that followed the passage of the Patient Protection and Advocacy Act, Rachel found herself both exhilarated and exhausted. The victory was monumental, but the real work was just beginning. Calls poured in from other states curious about implementing similar protocols. Rachel and Angela started fielding requests from advocacy groups and medical organizations across the country who wanted to know how they could replicate their success. The conference invitation Michael had mentioned sat on her desk as both a reminder and a beacon. It was scheduled to take place in Washington, D.C., and would feature speakers from all corners of the healthcare world: policymakers, patient advocates, and leaders in medical ethics. Rachel would be speaking on the opening day, sharing her story and the legislative journey that had sparked change. "You're ready for this," Angela said during one of their many late-night planning sessions. The office was dimly lit, files and papers scattered across every available surface. "You've carried this movement on your shoulders, and now you get to show the country why it matters." Rachel nodded, though her heart thudded with the weight of it all. The public face of the movement was hers, and while that was empowering, it was also daunting. "I just want to make sure that this leads to more than just awareness," she said, stacking papers into a neat pile. "Awareness is good, but it doesn't save lives on its own." Angela smiled, leaning back in her chair. "And that's why you're the perfect person for this. You don't just want change, you demand it." As preparations for the conference ramped up, Rachel found moments of quiet in the whirlwind, times when she could reflect on how far she'd come. One afternoon, she sat on the back porch with Michael, a rare pause in their busy schedules. The late autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a nearby house. Leaves rustled in a gentle breeze, the world shifting toward winter. Michael reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Nervous?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Rachel smiled softly. "A little," she admitted. "It's one thing to speak at a town hall, or even to the state senate. This is bigger. But it's still you," Michael said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Your story, your strength. That doesn't change, no matter how big the stage is." She looked at him, the quiet confidence in his eyes seeping into her bones. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for being my anchor through all of this." Michael chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Always." The conference hall in Washington, D.C., was expansive, with towering ceilings and rows of seats that seemed to stretch on forever. Rachel stood backstage, the muffled sound of conversations filtering through the curtains. The bright lights, the bustling energy of attendees finding their seats, it all seemed surreal. Angela, now a friend as much as an ally, stood beside her, clipboard in hand and an encouraging smile on her face. "You're up next," Angela said, her voice calm. "Remember, this isn't just a speech. This is the culmination of everything you've fought for." Rachel nodded, inhaling deeply as she stepped onto the stage. The spotlight was blinding at first, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw the faces in the crowd. Some familiar, many strangers, all waiting to hear what she had to say. "Good afternoon," Rachel began, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "A year ago, I walked into a doctor's office expecting care, expecting safety. What I experienced instead was fear and a profound sense of betrayal. But that moment, as painful as it was, became the catalyst for something greater." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I learned that my story wasn't unique. It was shared by countless others who had felt invisible or powerless in a place that should have been a sanctuary. And that realization pushed me to act, to ensure that no one would have to feel what I felt ever again." Rachel spoke of the legislation, the pilot programs, and the community that had rallied around the cause. She described the night of the town hall, the testimonies that had poured in, and the collective strength that had propelled them forward. "Change is never easy," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "But we are proof that it is possible. And we must continue, not just for those of us who have spoken out, but for those who are still waiting for their voices to be heard." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Some people stood, clapping with an intensity that made Rachel's chest tighten with emotion. She caught sight of Michael in the crowd, his eyes shining with pride. The conference sparked a surge of interest in patient rights and healthcare reform. Rachel's speech was shared online, reaching thousands who hadn't heard her story before. Offers to collaborate came flooding in, from community health organizations to national advocacy groups. The Patient Protection and Advocacy Act became a model for other states considering similar legislation. Back in Meadow Hill, the impact of the new protocols was becoming clear. Reports showed a decrease in patient grievances, and staff feedback indicated that communication and trust had improved. Lindsay, now heading up the hospital's patient advocacy department, kept Rachel updated with regular reports. "You should come by and see it for yourself," Lindsay said over the phone one morning. "It's not perfect, but it's different. Better." Rachel agreed and planned a visit. When she walked through the familiar hallways of Meadow Hill Medical Center, the changes were visible. Nurses interacted with patients more openly, explanations were given without prompting, and the overall atmosphere felt lighter, more welcoming. "Mrs. Turner," a nurse called out as Rachel passed by. She turned to see a young woman she didn't recognize. "I just wanted to say thank you. I started here a few months ago, and the advocacy program has made a world of difference for the patients. And for us." Rachel smiled, gratitude swelling in her chest. "I'm glad to hear that," she said. "It's why we fought so hard." One evening, as Rachel sat with Michael in their living room, the warmth of the fire casting shadows on the walls, she reflected on everything that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been easy, and there were still battles ahead, but the foundation had been laid. Michael leaned forward, pulling a newspaper from the coffee table. On the front page was an article about the Patient Protection and Advocacy Act and its successful implementation in Meadow Hill. The headline read, "A Voice for the Vulnerable: How One Woman Sparked Change in Healthcare." He handed it to Rachel, his smile wide and proud. "You're making history," he said. Rachel traced the headline with her finger, the weight of the journey settling into her heart. "We're making history," she corrected, looking at him with a smile. "And we're not done yet." The following months were filled with more speaking engagements, collaborative efforts with other states, and the establishment of training programs modeled after the Meadow Hill pilot. Voices for Justice evolved into a national organization, advocating for patient rights and supporting legislative efforts to replicate their success in other regions. Rachel's name became synonymous with patient advocacy, but she always made sure to share the spotlight with those who had supported her: Angela, Lindsay, Michael, and the countless people who had bravely shared their stories. One day, as Rachel prepared for another speaking event, she received an email from a woman named Marissa, who wrote, "Because of you, I found the courage to speak up about my experience. I know I'm not alone anymore, and for the first time in years, I feel seen. Thank you for everything." Rachel read the email twice, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. It was a reminder that the work they were doing was not just policy, it was personal. It was about lives, voices, and the belief that everyone deserved to be heard. She stood up, looking out the window as the sun set behind the skyline, casting the world in a warm, golden glow. The path ahead was still long, but it was lit by the steady flame of resilience, hope, and unyielding advocacy. As the months turned into a year since the Patient Protection and Advocacy Act had passed, Rachel reflected on the profound changes that had reshaped her life and the world around her. Voices for Justice had grown into a respected organization, its name recognized by patient advocates and healthcare professionals nationwide. Rachel had transitioned from being known primarily as the woman who survived a harrowing ordeal to a leader in the fight for patient rights. The work was far from over, but milestones had been reached. Hospitals in neighboring states began implementing similar patient advocacy programs, and Rachel's inbox was filled with invitations to consult on new legislative efforts. The momentum was undeniable, but with success came new challenges, ensuring the changes lasted and continued to grow. One morning, Rachel sat at her office desk in the Voices for Justice headquarters, a modest but bustling space filled with passionate staff members who had joined her mission. The room was alive with activity, phones ringing, papers rustling, conversations layered over one another in a tapestry of work and purpose. A knock at her door broke her concentration, and she looked up to see Angela standing there, a familiar smile on her face. "Busy as ever," Angela said, walking in and placing a folder on Rachel's desk. "I thought you'd want to see this." Rachel picked up the folder, her eyes scanning the cover page that read, Preliminary Report, Impact of the Patient Protection and Advocacy Act, Year 1. Her heart fluttered as she flipped through the pages. Charts and testimonies highlighted improvements. Patient satisfaction had increased, reports of misconduct had decreased, and more patients reported feeling empowered to voice concerns. "It's working," Rachel said, her voice barely a whisper, more to herself than to Angela. Angela nodded, the lines around her eyes softening. "It is, and other states are paying attention. We're getting requests for consultation from California, New York, and even some hospitals in the Midwest." "Rachel, this is bigger than I think any of us realized." Rachel looked up, meeting Angela's eyes. The enormity of what they had achieved, and what lay ahead, settled over her like a warm blanket. "We have to keep pushing," she said, setting the folder down. "If this can happen here, it can happen everywhere." The next few weeks were filled with trips to conferences and meetings with state legislators. Rachel became adept at balancing advocacy work with personal time, but Michael often reminded her to take breaks. One evening, after returning home from a meeting with community leaders, she found a note on the kitchen counter. "Dinner's on the patio. Take a breath. I'll see you there. Love, Michael." A smile curved her lips as she walked outside to find the table set with her favorite comfort food and a flickering candle casting a soft glow. Michael appeared from the corner of the yard, his hands tucked into his pockets, a grin on his face. "You've been running yourself ragged," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "I figured we could use a quiet night." Rachel sat, the weight of the day slipping off her shoulders as she exhaled. "I think you're right," she said, reaching for his hand across the table. "Thank you for reminding me." They shared stories from their day, the conversation flowing easily. As the night deepened, Rachel leaned back, looking up at the stars that dotted the inky sky. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" she asked, her voice soft with awe. Michael squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "I hope we would be, and you made it happen." Rachel turned to him, the love and gratitude swelling in her chest. "We made it happen, and we're not done yet." The expansion of Voices for Justice into other states brought new faces and stories to Rachel's attention. One story stood out, a woman named Nina Carter, who shared how she'd faced medical neglect in her own state's healthcare system. Inspired by Rachel's work, Nina had started organizing patients in her community, advocating for better standards and oversight. Rachel reached out to her, and soon Nina was part of the Voices for Justice team, working to replicate their successes in her own state. The organization's network grew, connecting voices that had once been isolated and powerless into a powerful coalition of advocates. "I used to think no one cared," Nina said one afternoon during a video conference. "But seeing what you did, it gave me hope that people will listen if we're loud enough." Rachel smiled, her voice warm. "They will, and we'll be there to make sure of it." The national media began to take greater notice of Rachel's work. One evening, she sat in a brightly lit studio in New York City, waiting to be interviewed by a major news anchor. The studio was alive with the buzz of production staff, the hum of cameras, and the rustle of scripts. Rachel took a deep breath as the countdown began, the weight of the moment pressing lightly on her shoulders. Tonight, we're joined by Rachel Turner, founder of Voices for Justice and a leader in the patient rights movement, the anchor said, turning to face Rachel with a warm smile. "Rachel, it's been quite a journey for you. Can you tell us what keeps you motivated to continue this fight?" Rachel leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What keeps me going is knowing that my story isn't unique. For every person who's come forward, there are countless others who haven't. I keep going because every voice matters, and because trust in healthcare should be a given, not a privilege." The interview continued, touching on the successes of the past year and the challenges ahead. By the end, Rachel felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. As she left the studio, her phone buzzed with messages from Michael, Angela, and Lindsay, each one full of encouragement and praise. Back home, Rachel continued to push for change, knowing that the road would be long. But the work had changed her. It had given her purpose beyond the pain. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a leader, an advocate, and a voice for the vulnerable. One day, As she sat in her office going through notes for an upcoming panel discussion, she received an unexpected call. It was Dr. Ellis from Meadow Hill Medical Center. "Rachel, I wanted to let you know that the hospital has officially named our new patient advocacy wing after you, the Rachel Turner Center for Patient Advocacy. We thought it was only fitting, considering what you've done not just for us, but for patients everywhere." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat, the words catching her by surprise. I don't know what to say, Dr. Ellis. Thank you. No, Rachel. Thank you, he said, his voice genuine. You reminded us why we're here, why we do this. Rachel sat in stunned silence after the call, the weight of the recognition settling into her heart. The journey had been painful, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but it had led to this, a legacy not just of survival, but of strength, change, and hope. As the sun set outside her window, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson, Rachel stood up, feeling a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. She had built something that would endure, a testament to the power of speaking out and standing up, even when it felt impossible. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would continue to fight, ensuring that every voice, every story was heard. Rachel sat in her office, sunlight streaming through the large windows and casting warm pools of light on the floor. The framed newspaper articles, awards, and letters of gratitude that adorned the walls reminded her how far she had come. But more than the accolades, it was the stories of people who had been empowered by her work that fueled her. Each letter or email she read spoke of patients reclaiming their dignity and advocating for themselves in ways they hadn't thought possible before. That afternoon, Lindsay visited the Voices for Justice headquarters, bringing fresh data on the patient advocacy programs they had implemented. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement as she laid out a stack of papers on Rachel's desk. "You're going to love this," Lindsay said, spreading out the reports. "Patient satisfaction rates have increased by 40% since we started the training programs. And the number of grievances filed has dropped significantly, not because people are afraid to report issues, but because those issues are being addressed before they escalate." Rachel scanned the pages, her eyes widening as she took in the statistics. "This is incredible, Lindsay," she said, her voice tinged with amazement. "It means people are being heard. It means what we're doing is working." Lindsay nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "It's not just about numbers, Rachel. I've had patients tell me they finally feel safe, that they know they won't be dismissed or overlooked. It's changing the culture." The words settled in Rachel's chest, a warm glow spreading through her. "Thank you for telling me this. Sometimes in the middle of all the work, it's easy to forget why we started. But this is why." Rachel's work continued to draw attention, and one day, she received an invitation to meet with representatives from a major healthcare organization in Chicago. The goal was to explore integrating similar advocacy programs into their hospital network, one of the largest in the Midwest. It was an opportunity to expand the impact of Voices for Justice even further, and Rachel felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Angela joined her on the trip, the two women arriving in Chicago to a skyline gleaming with promise. The meeting room in the healthcare organization's headquarters was sleek and modern, filled with executives who greeted Rachel with warm handshakes and polite nods. "Mrs. Turner, your work has been an inspiration," said Dr. Patel, the head of the organization. His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to leading, but also held a note of genuine respect. "We're very interested in learning how we can adopt similar patient advocacy measures across our facilities." Rachel felt the familiar rush of purpose as she began to outline the steps they had taken in Meadow Hill, from staff training to patient feedback loops. Angela chimed in with legal frameworks and the challenges they had navigated to implement systemic change. "One of the key elements," Rachel emphasized, "is creating an environment where both patients and staff feel valued and heard. It's not just about preventing mistakes. It's about fostering trust." The room was quiet as she finished speaking, the weight of her words sinking in. Dr. Patel leaned forward, his eyes thoughtful. "Trust is something that's difficult to build and easy to lose. Your work shows that it can be rebuilt with intention and dedication. We'd like to pilot your program in 3 of our hospitals and see how we can scale from there." A wave of relief and excitement washed over Rachel. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. We're ready to help in any way we can." Back at home, Rachel's life found a new rhythm. She balanced her time between public speaking, advocacy work, and personal moments with Michael that grounded her amid the whirlwind. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, Michael turned to her, his eyes soft. "You've changed so much, Rachel," he said, a hint of awe in his voice. "Not just for other people, but for yourself. You're stronger now." Rachel smiled, the words settling into her heart. "I think I had to be," she admitted. "But it's not just me. It's everyone who believed in this, who shared their stories and stood up when it was hard. I'm just one piece of it." Michael reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "And that's what makes it powerful. You've never done this alone." She looked out at the quiet street, the warm glow of street lights casting shadows that felt more familiar than menacing. "I know," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And that's the best part." The following month, Rachel and Angela attended the opening of the new Rachel Turner Center for Patient Advocacy at Meadow Hill Medical Center. The event was filled with hospital staff, community members, and patients who had come to know Rachel's name as synonymous with change and hope. The center was a space designed to offer resources for patients and staff alike, a place where grievances could be heard and resolved, and where training sessions reinforced the value of empathy and communication. As Rachel stood at the podium, the plaque behind her gleaming under the afternoon sun, she felt a rush of emotions: pride, gratitude, and a sense of fulfillment that was hard to put into words. "This center represents more than just my story," she began, her voice steady but full of feeling. "It represents every patient who has felt invisible, every nurse or doctor who wanted to do better but didn't know how, and every community that believes in accountability and compassion. This is for all of us." The applause that followed was like a heartbeat, steady and strong, echoing in a space that had once felt sterile and distant, but now felt like a testament to resilience. Lindsay approached her afterward, a grin on her face. "You did it, Rachel. You really did it." Rachel laughed, the sound light and filled with relief. "We did it," she corrected, looking around at the faces of those who had supported her journey. "And we're just getting started." Months turned into years, and Voices for Justice became a national movement. Hospitals and clinics from coast to coast adopted the patient advocacy protocols, and Rachel found herself collaborating with policymakers and activists she had once admired from afar. But through it all, she remained committed to the simple truth that had started it all. Every person deserved to feel safe and respected in the places meant to heal them. One day, as Rachel sat in her office, sorting through letters, she found one that stood out. It was from a young woman named Sophie, who had been inspired by Rachel's story to pursue a career in patient advocacy. The letter read, "I used to feel powerless, like my voice didn't matter. But seeing what you've done made me believe that I could make a difference too. I'm now studying to become a healthcare advocate, and it's because of you. Thank you for showing me that change is possible." Rachel closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. The path she had taken had been steep and filled with pain, but it had led to this, a movement that was bigger than her, a legacy that promised change and hope. As she opened her eyes, she looked at the framed photo of herself and Michael from the early days of their fight, a time when hope was a fragile thing. Now, it was a flame, burning bright and steady, lighting the way for others to follow. And as long as she had the strength, Rachel would continue to lead the way. Thank you for joining Rachel's journey, a story of resilience, hope, and the power of one voice sparking change. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales that uplift and remind us of the importance of courage and advocacy. Leave a comment to share your thoughts and help spread these stories by sharing with others. Together, we can keep the flame of hope burning bright.